Jack, Mitch, Reed, and Danny arrived at the isolated logging camp deep in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where the dense forest stretched endlessly in every direction, towering pines shrouded in mist. The sky hung heavy with grey clouds, and a constant drizzle fell from the heavens, turning the dirt roads into a slick, treacherous mess. The camp, intended to house dozens of loggers, was nearly abandoned, its empty buildings standing like ghostly sentinels at the edge of the wilderness. "Where is everyone?" Danny asked, his voice breaking the eerie silence as he looked around at the vacant bunks and empty cabins. His voice echoed slightly in the damp air, adding to the unsettling feeling that hung over the place. Mitch snorted and dropped his duffel bag on one of the cots. "Maybe they got better jobs," he said with a dismissive shrug, tossing a glance at the others. "Or maybe they know something we don't." Jack, the oldest of the crew and the quietest, remained still, his gaze fixed on the tree line beyond the camp, as if something there was beckoning him. He'd heard of this place before, whispers of strange happenings that didn't quite add up. The stories didn't sit right with him, and though he wasn't one to believe in folklore, his instincts told him something was off. His gut tightened as his eyes scanned the thick woods, the towering trees almost seeming to press in on him. The others went about setting up the camp, but Jack lingered by the window of the cabin, watching the forest. Something about the stillness of the air, despite the rain, felt unnatural. The wind wasn't moving the trees as it should have. It was as though the world around them had fallen into a stagnant pause. Jack took a deep breath and forced himself to shake it off. They were here to work, not to dwell on whatever nonsense the others might have heard in town. They had a job to do. But Jack couldn't escape the feeling that the woods were watching them, waiting. As the others busied themselves with unpacking and preparing for the day's work, Jack remained at the window, his muscles tense, his senses alert. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "Jack, you comin'?" Reed's voice called from the doorway, snapping Jack out of his thoughts. "Yeah," Jack muttered, turning away from the window. He grabbed his gear and followed the others out into the drizzle, determined to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. The next morning, the damp chill of the rain clung to their skin as the men worked through the day, their movements purposeful and mechanical. Chainsaws roared to life, cutting through the wet trunks of trees with a sharp, rhythmic sound. The air smelled of fresh wood, damp earth, and rain, but there was an underlying musk, something far older, that seemed to seep from the ground itself. The forest was alive with sound, the occasional crash of a falling tree echoing through the wet silence. By midday, they had already downed several acres of timber. Mitch was the loudest of the crew, cracking jokes and getting into the rhythm of the work. Reed was quieter, a man of few words, but a steady worker, constantly scanning the trees as if expecting something to come crashing through the underbrush at any moment. Danny, ever the optimist, kept up his chatter, talking about everything from his favorite movies to the latest gossip in the town back home. But Jack was the quietest, moving through the tasks with a practiced ease, his eyes always flicking to the edges of the forest. His mind wasn't on the trees, but on the strange sense of being watched. He kept his gaze trained on the dense undergrowth, listening to the unsettling silence that seemed to envelope the woods as they worked. They'd finished their first stretch by mid-afternoon, the weather turning colder and the clouds growing darker. Jack's mind, however, hadn't strayed far from the tree line. The sense of unease was growing. He'd seen something earlier, just a flicker, a shape low to the ground, moving unnaturally fast. But when he turned to tell the others, it had vanished. Was it just his imagination? Or had something truly been there? "Where the hell is my axe?" Reed's voice cut through the air, snapping Jack from his thoughts. Reed was crouched low, scanning the ground as he kicked through the mud and debris. "I left it right here," Reed muttered again, his frustration clear. Mitch looked up from where he was sharpening his chainsaw. "Probably got buried under debris," he said, wiping his brow. Danny chuckled from where he was stowing his gear. Maybe you're seeing things. You've been on edge all day, Reed. But Jack remained silent, his gaze locked onto the forest's edge. That flicker he'd seen earlier. It had been too fast, too deliberate. It was as though something had been watching them, waiting. Jack's muscles were tight with the effort of ignoring the feeling, but he couldn't shake the sensation that something was drawing nearer. The rain intensified, turning into a steady downpour, and the men retreated to the cabin for the night. Inside, the warmth of the stove was a relief, but Jack couldn't shake the cold chill that settled over him. As the hours wore on, the low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky, mixing with the relentless patter of rain against the cabin roof. As they gathered around the stove, the conversation shifted. They had worked hard today, but none of them seemed eager to relax. "So, anyone else heard the stories about this place?" Reed asked, his voice carrying an air of forced casualness as he stirred his coffee. Mitch rolled his eyes and leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out. "You mean the folklore? About some... what? A dogman? Please." Danny, who had been quieter than usual, smirked. "Supposedly, people went missing up here. Said they saw something big. Half man, half wolf. Smelled like death." Jack remained silent, tightening his grip on his mug. The legends of the Dogman. He'd heard them before, whispered by locals and outsiders alike. But there was something about them that never sat right with him. This place... The atmosphere was thick, as though it carried the weight of centuries of forgotten secrets. And if there was one thing Jack had learned over the years, it was that sometimes the stories held more truth than anyone was willing to admit. Reed chuckled, shaking his head. "That's why we're getting paid so much," he joked. "Hazard pay for werewolves." The others laughed, but Jack's laugh was hollow. He couldn't bring himself to join in. There was a weight to the silence in the cabin that made it feel too close, as though the walls themselves were listening. He stood up, leaving the others to their banter, and made his way to his bunk. Outside, beyond the misty tree line, something stirred, its presence just out of sight. Jack couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there, watching. And the longer they stayed, the more it felt as though the forest was closing in on them, like a trap, slowly tightening its grip. The rain had not relented by the time night fell. The constant patter against the roof created a rhythm that should have been soothing, but instead it felt ominous, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something Jack couldn't quite grasp. He sat by the stove, his mind far from the heat of the fire, his eyes tracing the shapes of shadows dancing across the cabin walls. The others were quieter than usual. Reed and Danny sat at the table playing cards while Mitch fiddled with his gear. Their laughter and casual banter only highlighted the growing tension that Jack felt. His skin prickled as the silence between words seemed to stretch, like something, or someone, was lurking just beyond the threshold of their perception. "So, anyone else heard the stories about this place?" Reed broke the quiet, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Mitch snorted, clearly unimpressed. "You mean the folklore? About some... what? A dogman? Please." Danny leaned in, a mischievous grin on his face. "Supposedly, people went missing up here. Said they saw something big. Half man, half wolf. Smelled like death." Jack clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his mug. He had heard the stories before, but they weren't what concerned him. It was the feeling that the woods were watching them, that they were being herded towards something, a fate they couldn't escape. "Jack?" Danny's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You all right?" Jack nodded curtly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." Reed chuckled, rolling his eyes. "Don't tell me you're spooked by a few old ghost stories." Jack didn't answer. The laughter of the group faded into the background, replaced by the ominous sound of the wind howling through the trees. The storm outside had picked up in intensity, the wind now whipping against the sides of the cabin as though trying to tear it apart. At first, it was nothing more than a faint rustling, the kind that might be explained away by the wind. But then it grew, soft at first, like the snap of a twig underfoot, followed by another and another, each closer than the last. It was something moving through the trees, something that wasn't the wind. "Did you hear that?" Reed asked, his voice low. Mitch froze, his head cocking to one side. "What was that?" Jack was already standing, his hand instinctively moving to the handle of his hatchet. His pulse quickened, a gut feeling he couldn't ignore. He had been trained for moments like this, but nothing had prepared him for the unease gnawing at his insides. "There's something out there," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The others exchanged uneasy glances, their joking demeanor faltering for the first time. Then, as though in answer to Jack's words, there came a low, guttural growl, deep and throaty. It rumbled through the cabin walls, vibrating in their chests, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier. Reed's face paled, his earlier bravado forgotten. "What the hell was that?" "That wasn't an animal," Jack said, his voice grim. He turned toward the door, his gaze scanning the dark beyond the window. The wind howled again, but this time it carried something else, a faint, high-pitched whistle, almost like a distant scream, cut through the storm. "No one leave the cabin," Jack ordered, his eyes hard. He glanced at the others, and they nodded, understanding the gravity of his tone. They all sat, their eyes fixed on the door, waiting. The sound of the growling seemed to move around the cabin, circling like a predator testing its prey. Jack could feel it in his bones, the sense that something was toying with them, drawing closer with each passing minute. Outside, the rain was deafening, but the forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, nothing. Just the growl getting closer. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, the walls shaking from the force. It was like something had struck the outside of the building with massive force. "Inside, now," Jack growled, grabbing a lantern from the table and handing it to Reed. He wasn't sure what was out there, but his instincts told him that whatever it was not human. Reed fumbled with the lantern, his hands trembling as he tried to light it. The light flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin. Jack's eyes never left the door. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like they were being watched. Not from the forest, but from something else. Something that knew them. Then the scratching began. Slow at first, but gradually increasing in intensity. Something, or someone, was outside, dragging sharp claws across the wooden walls. The noise was bone-chilling, sending a shiver down their spines. "Shut the hell up," Mitch shouted, slamming his fist against the table. "It's probably just an animal, a bear, or some damn raccoons." But Jack knew better. This wasn't normal. There was something out there that shouldn't be, something they weren't meant to understand. Then, as if in response to Mitch's outburst, the growl came again, this time closer, louder, and the door shuddered under the impact of something heavy, slamming against it with such force that the hinges rattled. The growl turned into a scream, a terrible, shrill sound that made their blood run cold. The scratching stopped. A deep silence followed, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Jack took a slow, deliberate breath, his mind racing. He had no idea what this creature was, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to let them leave easily. The night stretched on, each moment heavier than the last. The following morning, the sun barely filtered through the thick canopy above, casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor. The previous night's growls still reverberated in Jack's mind as he gathered his gear. His heart was still pounding in his chest. The team moved slower now, their eyes darting nervously to the dense underbrush, their senses heightened to every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. Reed muttered something about setting up more traps, but his voice was strained, unnerved. They had not spoken much since the attack the night before. Words felt too heavy, too dangerous in this place. Jack, ever the leader in situations like this, didn't need to be told. He was already scanning the area, mentally mapping out the best places for traps, positioning them for whatever was out there. They worked in silence, Jack's trained eyes catching every movement, every change in the wind. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that they finally took a break, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of a small clearing. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. Mitch wiped sweat from his brow. "This place is messed up, man. No wildlife, no birds. It's like the whole damn forest is holding its breath." Jack said nothing, his gaze fixed on the tree line. He had seen this before, an unnatural stillness, an absence of life. It was as though something was driving everything out of the woods. Suddenly, Danny stood up, scanning the opposite side of the clearing. "What's that over there?" Everyone turned to look. Through the haze of mist, Jack saw it, a dark shape moving quickly along the edge of the woods. His heart skipped a beat. "Get down," he hissed. The group crouched, trying to remain unseen as the creature moved closer. Jack's pulse raced. It was fast, too fast for any man or animal he had ever seen. The shape was humanoid, but the way it moved, so fluid and unnatural, made it impossible to fully make out. The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood up. It knew they were there, just as it always had. His grip tightened on his rifle. "Jack," Mitch whispered, voice quivering. "We stay quiet," Jack commanded. His eyes never left the spot where the creature had been. They waited in complete silence, every muscle taut with tension. The wind picked up slightly, but the forest still felt wrong, unnaturally quiet. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The creature had vanished into the woods again, but Jack didn't trust it. He knew it was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He motioned for the group to move back, slowly and carefully. As they retreated, Jack heard it again, the sound of snapping twigs. The creature was still out there. It was hunting them now. They made their way back to the cabin, their senses on high alert, moving swiftly but cautiously. Each step felt like a death sentence, each breath caught in their throats. By the time they reached the safety of the cabin, dusk had settled, and the forest around them was cloaked in shadows. The wind had picked up, howling like something, or someone, angry. Jack felt it before he saw it, a deep, guttural growl coming from the trees. It was too close, too damn close. Mitch was already reaching for his rifle, but Jack stopped him with a sharp gesture. "Stay quiet." The growl intensified, rising and falling in rhythm, almost like a mocking laugh. Then there was movement, a blur through the trees. Jack's breath hitched in his chest as the creature emerged from the shadows, its glowing yellow eyes reflecting the dim light. It was massive, standing at least 7 feet tall, its fur matted and slick with rain. Reed cursed under his breath, backing up into the cabin. Jack didn't move, though his heart was racing. He could feel it, that same primal instinct urging him to flee, but he wouldn't run. Not yet. The creature snarled, showing rows of sharp yellow teeth. It was like a wolf, but wrong, so wrong. The way it stood on 2 legs, the size of its hands, the way its arms stretched unnaturally long. This wasn't some animal. This was something far worse. "We have to kill it," Jack whispered, voice steady despite the terror flooding his veins. "We need a plan," Mitch hissed, eyes wide. "We don't stand a chance just running in there." "Wait for it to get closer," Jack said, scanning the area. The tripwires would be their best chance to slow it down. "When it gets near the clearing, I'll set off the traps. We need to keep it from getting inside." The group nodded, the reality of the situation settling in. The creature was closing in now, its growls vibrating through the walls of the cabin. It was testing them, testing their resolve. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature disappeared into the trees. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Everyone stood frozen, listening. Jack's instincts screamed at him that it was far from over. They waited and waited. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The growling had stopped, but Jack knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Then, without warning, the creature struck. The sound of heavy footsteps on the cabin's roof caused the men to jump, hearts racing. The roof groaned under its weight as something massive crawled across it, claws scraping the metal. Jack's hand tightened around his rifle. "Stay low," Jack muttered. "It's coming down." The door burst open with a force that shook the cabin. The creature was inside. It had gotten past the traps. Jack barely had time to brace himself before the grenade detonated. The explosion sent a shockwave through the cabin, blasting apart the wooden walls and sending flaming debris in every direction. The force knocked him flat, his ears ringing as the world tilted. Smoke and fire filled the cabin as Jack coughed, struggling to push himself up. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to focus. The beast had been caught in the blast, its massive body thrown against the far wall, half shrouded in the thick smoke. Through the haze, Jack saw Reed, barely conscious, dragging himself toward the door. Mitch lay motionless near the wreckage, his face bloodied. The creature's deep, guttural growl rumbled through the room as it shifted in the darkness. It was still alive. Jack gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around his rifle. His mind raced. Nothing was working. Bullets barely slowed it down. Explosives weren't enough. If they didn't end this now, they wouldn't get another chance. The fire spread fast, licking up the wooden beams, filling the cabin with an orange glow. Smoke stung his lungs, forcing him to move. He staggered toward Mitch, gripping his arm. "Come on, we gotta go," Mitch groaned, stirring slightly. His eyes fluttered open, dazed. "Jack." Before Jack could answer, a massive clawed hand reached through the smoke. The beast surged forward, its body burned and torn from the blast, but still moving with terrifying strength. Its yellow eyes locked onto Jack, filled with rage. Jack barely dodged as the creature swiped at him, its claws cutting deep into the wooden floor where he had stood moments before. Splinters exploded into the air. Reed had made it to the door, but he hesitated, glancing back. "Jack, move!" Jack grabbed Mitch under the arm, hauling him up with every ounce of strength he had left. They stumbled toward the doorway just as the beast lunged again. A burning wooden beam collapsed from the ceiling, crashing down between them and the creature. Fire roared, cutting off the beast's path. It let out a furious, ear-splitting howl. Jack didn't waste a second. He pulled Mitch through the doorway, stumbling into the cold night air. Reed was already outside, breathing heavily. The cabin was fully ablaze now, flames consuming the walls, the roof, everything. Smoke curled into the sky, embers drifting through the trees. The creature was still inside, its silhouette barely visible through the raging fire. Jack's chest heaved. Was it finally over? The three of them stood there watching, waiting. The fire crackled, the heat pressing against their skin even from a distance. The beast howled one last time, a deep, guttural sound that echoed into the night. Then silence. Jack's hands trembled. He had hunted monsters before, but nothing like this. Mitch coughed, still shaky. Did we kill it? Jack didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the fire. Something deep inside him said no. And then, a movement. From the burning wreckage of the cabin, something shifted, something massive. Jack's stomach turned to ice. "Oh, hell," Reed whispered. The beast wasn't dead, and it was coming. Jack's breath hitched as the burning wreckage shifted. Charred wood collapsed in on itself, sending a cascade of embers into the air. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed through the night. From the flames, the beast emerged. Its fur was scorched, patches of raw, blistered flesh exposed beneath the smoldering remains of its thick hide. Its eyes, those hellish yellow orbs, burned with something beyond rage, beyond pain. It was still standing, still hunting. "Run!" Jack's voice was barely above a whisper, then louder. Run! Mitch and Reed didn't hesitate. They turned and bolted into the dark forest, Jack right behind them. Branches snapped underfoot, and the cold night air burned in his lungs as he sprinted through the trees. Behind them, the beast crashed through the brush, its heavy footfalls pounding like distant thunder. Jack dared a glance back. The fire had wounded it, but it wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was angrier, more desperate. "Where the hell are we going?" Mitch gasped between breaths. "The river," Jack said. "We lose our scent in the water." The river wasn't far, maybe half a mile, but half a mile was an eternity, with a monster on their heels. Branches clawed at Jack's arms as he pushed forward, his boots slipping on damp earth. Reed was just ahead, guiding them toward the steep slope that led to the riverbank. Then a deafening roar. Jack turned just in time to see the beast lunge at Mitch. It slammed into him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Mitch let out a strangled cry as the creature's claws raked across his back. "No!" Jack didn't think, he just acted. He raised his rifle and fired. The first shot hit the beast's shoulder, staggering it slightly. The second grazed its side. It barely flinched. Reed was already at Mitch's side, dragging him up. "Move! Move! Move!" The river was close now, the rushing water faintly audible through the trees. Jack fired again, aiming for the creature's eyes, but it ducked at the last second, charging forward with terrifying speed. They reached the slope. Jack grabbed Mitch's arm, helping him down the incline. The river came into view, a dark, churning mass of water cutting through the dense forest. No time to hesitate. Jack leaped, plunging into the icy current. The cold was like 1,000 knives stabbing into his skin, but he forced himself forward. Reed followed, dragging Mitch with him. The river's current pulled them downstream, away from the pursuing monster. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the beast roared in frustration from the bank, pacing back and forth. It wouldn't follow them into the water, not yet. But Jack knew it wasn't giving up, and the fight wasn't over. The current carried them farther downstream, but the frigid water was quickly sapping Jack's strength. He paddled toward the shore, struggling against the icy pull. Reed and Mitch reached land first, dragging themselves onto the muddy bank. Jack followed, collapsing onto his hands and knees, gasping for air. Mitch groaned. "Please tell me we lost it." Jack didn't answer. He already knew the truth. The beast wasn't gone. It was waiting. Reed pulled his soaked rifle strap over his shoulder. "What's the plan?" Jack stared into the dark woods. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the night stretched out, endless and watching. Then the sound came, a deep, slow breath, from the darkness just beyond their sight. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. We end this. They had one chance, one final stand. Running wouldn't work. The town was too far, and Mitch wouldn't make it with his wounds. If they were going to survive, they had to kill it. Jack scanned the area. The river had eroded the bank, leaving a sharp drop-off behind them. If they could bait the creature close enough. "Reed, explosives?" Jack asked. Reed checked his belt. "One charge left. Not enough to blow it apart, but..." Jack nodded. "It'll have to do." They set the trap quickly, wiring the explosive to a fallen tree at the edge of the bank. If they timed it right, they could send the beast tumbling into the river, and with any luck, the blast would finish it off. Then, the growl. It was here. The beast emerged from the trees, its massive form barely visible in the dim moonlight. Its fur was slick with blood, some its own, some Mitch's. It stood on the far side of the clearing, staring them down, waiting. Jack raised his rifle. "Come on, you son of a..." The beast charged. Jack fired. One shot, two. The bullets hit, but the creature barely flinched. Reed held the detonator, sweat dripping down his face. Closer. Closer. Mitch, wounded but standing, raised his sidearm and fired a desperate shot. It hit the creature square in the eye. The beast roared, stumbling, just for a second. It was enough. Jack dove aside as Reed hit the trigger. The explosion ripped through the night. The force shattered the ground beneath the beast, sending it sprawling backward. The edge of the bank crumbled, and the creature let out a final, furious howl as it tumbled into the raging river below. Jack staggered to his feet, watching as the dark water swallowed it whole. The silence that followed was deafening. The three of them stood there, gasping, shivering, waiting for something. Nothing came. Jack exhaled slowly. "It's over." Reed let out a shaky laugh. "I'll believe that when we're home." Mitch groaned. "Next time, let's hunt something smaller." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "No, next time." But as they turned away, heading toward the distant lights of civilization, none of them saw the ripple in the water. A single clawed hand reaching from the depths, and then gone. If you're reading this, then you already know how it ends. Maybe search crews found my tent. Maybe they followed the claw marks, the blood. Maybe they didn't find me at all. I hope they don't. My name is Nathan Cross. I am, or was, an experienced hiker. I've walked trails across the country, from the Rockies to the Appalachians, from the deserts of Utah to the swamps of Louisiana. I've seen towering redwoods, glacial peaks, endless plains. And I've always loved the woods more than anywhere else. The silence, the way the wind whispers through the trees, the feeling of being truly alone. Not in the lonely way, but in the free, untethered way. I thought I knew the wild. I was wrong. This time, I chose Michigan's Lower Peninsula, a stretch of deep, nearly untouched forest, miles from the nearest town. It was an unmarked trail, known only to locals and the most dedicated outdoorsmen. I had read about it in an old forum post. Someone had mentioned a secluded route near Wexford County, a path that wound through dense pine and hardwood forests, past hidden lakes and forgotten logging roads. No cell service, no human contact. It was perfect. I set out on a Monday, parking my truck on the shoulder of a dirt road before stepping into the tree line. The first day was incredible. The autumn leaves were just beginning to change, golden yellows and deep reds painting the canopy above. The air smelled crisp, fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I hiked for nearly 8 hours, my pack comfortably heavy on my shoulders, the rhythm of my boots on the ground steady and familiar. By dusk, I had reached a small clearing beside a narrow, glassy lake. I made camp there, setting up my tent just beyond the water's edge. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat watching the stars blink to life. And that's when I noticed the silence. Not just quiet, true suffocating silence. The kind that makes your ears strain, that makes your heartbeat sound too loud in your own chest. No owls, no rustling leaves, no distant howls of coyotes. The woods were holding their breath. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the animals had settled in for the night. But the feeling gnawed at me, like I was being watched. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees, I heard it. A howl. It wasn't a wolf, it wasn't a coyote. It was deeper, distorted, almost human. And it was close. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the tree line, but the beam caught only swaying branches and shifting shadows. Nothing. But I could feel it out there, just beyond the light, watching. I told myself to sleep. It was probably nothing. Probably. But I had never felt fear like that before, and I had no idea that it was only the beginning. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, throwing faint, flickering light against the walls of my tent. I lay inside my sleeping bag, eyes open, staring at the fabric ceiling above me. My heartbeat felt too loud, too fast. I told myself it was just nerves, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the woods were still too quiet. I turned onto my side, listening. The howl I had heard earlier still echoed in my memory, that unnatural, warped cry that had set every instinct in me on edge. My flashlight was within arm's reach, and I found myself gripping it without realizing. Then, a crunch. Soft, deliberate. A footstep. Somewhere just beyond my tent. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, listening for anything more, but the silence pressed down around me once again. My first thought was a bear. But bears weren't stealthy. A deer. No, the step had been too heavy. Too precise. I reached slowly for the knife I always kept in my pack. My fingers found the handle, curled around it. I listened. Another step. This time, closer. I sat up, careful to make as little noise as possible. My pulse pounded in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to wait, but I had to know. I clicked on my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. Nothing. The lake was still, smooth as glass. My fire had nearly died out, casting long, shifting shadows. I held my breath and listened. Silence. I let out a slow exhale. Maybe it had just been my imagination. Maybe the woods weren't as quiet as I thought, and I was just hearing the normal shifting of the forest. Then I saw them. Eyes. Reflective, like an animal's, catching the light from my dying fire. They were low to the ground at first, near the base of a tree, staring directly at me. Then they rose. Higher, higher, too high. I slammed the tent zipper shut, my hands shaking. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. What the hell had I just seen? No animal stood that tall. And those eyes, there was something wrong about them, something aware. For what felt like hours, I sat there, gripping my knife, flashlight clutched in my other hand, listening for any movement. But there was nothing. Just the endless, suffocating quiet. Eventually, exhaustion won. My head grew heavy, my limbs sluggish. I lay back down, forcing my eyes shut. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, one last thought echoed in my mind. It was watching me, and it wasn't afraid. The sun had barely risen when I woke, the faint light struggling to push through the thick canopy above. My mind swam in a haze, confusion mixing with the terror that had crept into my bones the night before. I pushed myself to sit up, my body sore and stiff from the uncomfortable sleep. I still clutched my flashlight in one hand, and the knife was tucked under the edge of my sleeping bag. I stared at the forest through the small crack in the tent. The trees stood still, motionless, bathed in the pale morning light. For a moment, it felt like everything had returned to normal. The silence was gone, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Birds were beginning to call out in the distance, and the forest felt alive again. But that one thing remained. The eyes, the image of those eyes, glowing in the dark, too high, too unnatural, burned into my mind. I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a deer or a bear or any animal I had ever encountered in all my years of hiking. Whatever it was something else, something that didn't belong in the woods. I stood slowly, careful not to make too much noise, and packed up my gear. The morning passed in a blur of mechanical movements, my mind too focused on what lay ahead. I couldn't stay here, not after what I had seen. I shoved the tent into its bag, packed my things, and grabbed my backpack. The trail ahead twisted into the thick of the woods, and though I knew it would be a long, hard hike back, I had to get out of here. The air had changed since last night. It felt heavier, charged with something unseen, something I couldn't name. I took my first few steps toward the trail and stopped dead in my tracks. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I approached, the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. A mark. Carved into the bark of a tree just off the trail, in what could only be described as a deliberate fashion, was a symbol, a crude, jagged marking. It looked almost like an animal's claw had scraped through the wood, but it was too controlled, too precise. A circle was gouged into the trunk, and inside the circle, deep gouges ran vertically, like someone, or something, had taken care to scratch it deeply. It was fresh. I looked around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the breath in my lungs tight with fear. The woods felt different now, darker somehow. The wind had stopped, leaving only the oppressive stillness. I stepped closer to inspect the mark, but the air around me seemed to thicken, like the trees themselves were closing in. The hairs on my arms prickled as I stood frozen, staring at the carving. And that's when I heard it, a soft whisper. Not from the wind, but from the trees themselves. A low, guttural murmur that was unmistakably human. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the forest remained silent. No eyes watching, no sounds of movement, nothing. I was alone, or so I thought. I took a step back, heart racing. The mark was not some random scratch. It was a message, a warning. But what was it warning me about? I wanted to turn and leave, but a sudden noise from the forest stopped me. Another crunch, just like last night. But this time, it was closer. Too close. I swung around, flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam cutting through the dense woods, but I saw nothing. Just the dark shadows of the trees stretching far beyond where the light could reach. Then, from behind me, I heard it again. The whisper. It was closer this time. I could feel it, like a presence brushing the back of my neck. I turned slowly, shining the light around, trying to find the source. But the beam only revealed the trees and the path behind me. Nothing. The whisper continued, louder now, more distinct. It wasn't a voice, but something worse. It sounded like an animal mimicking speech. Broken, fragmented words that didn't make sense. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out. I took a deep breath and forced my legs to move, turning back to the trail. But the trail seemed different now. The trees that had lined the path before now felt like they were closing in, narrowing, pressing me forward. Another crunch from behind. I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. I forced myself into a run, adrenaline pumping through my veins, my breath ragged and sharp in the cold air. The woods around me seemed to shift, like the trees were bending toward me, stretching toward my every step. My mind raced, desperate to make sense of everything. But then I saw it, the lake. The same glassy water where I had camped the night before. I'd somehow ended up in a loop, back at the same place, as if the forest had tricked me into returning. I glanced around, breath caught in my throat. The trees were still, but I could feel something watching me from the edge of the woods. I backed away from the water, scanning the tree line. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unsteady. I needed to make it to the road. I needed to get out. But the moment I turned to leave, I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the trees, partially hidden by the thick branches. It was too tall, too wide, its shape unsettlingly wrong. And then the eyes, those damn eyes, glowed from the darkness, like twin beacons, watching me. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't be in this world. I turned and bolted. My feet pounded against the ground, the underbrush snapping under my weight. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't stop running. But the sound behind me grew louder. It was close, too close, and that's when I heard the howl again. But this time, it wasn't a howl. It was a laugh. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, each step taking me further away from the figure at the edge of the trees. But the sound of that laugh, a deep, guttural mockery, echoed in my mind, clawing at my sanity. The woods, once so familiar and peaceful, had transformed into something monstrous, a labyrinth of shadows and dread. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves in the wind, made my heart jump in my chest. I didn't dare to look back. I could feel it, though. The weight of its presence. The way the air shifted around me, thick with something I couldn't name. It was closing in. I could hear it just behind me. Its footsteps moving with precision, too quiet to be human, too deliberate to be animal. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, the path jagged and overgrown, but I forced myself to keep running. I was losing my sense of direction. I'd passed the same rock twice, and the trees now seemed to have shifted positions, their shadows longer and more twisted than before. Panic surged within me as I realized this wasn't the forest I had been walking through earlier. It was as though the woods themselves were alive, shifting to trap me. I stumbled and fell to my knees, breathless, disoriented. I looked around, my flashlight swinging wildly, but everything seemed wrong. The trees seemed closer, the darkness more oppressive. I couldn't escape. I was caught in this nightmare, unable to tell if I was still in the same forest, or if the forest had become something else altogether. The laugh came again, louder now. It wasn't just a laugh, it was a voice that was simultaneously deep and hollow, as if it came from the very earth itself. It made my skin crawl, my blood run cold. "Are you lost, Nathan?" the voice whispered, though I couldn't tell if it was coming from the trees, the wind, or inside my own head. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. The air around me seemed to thicken, suffocating me with its weight. I could feel the very earth under my feet pulsing, like the ground was alive and breathing. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else, as I slowly raised my flashlight toward the sound. There, standing in the shadows between the trees, I saw the shape again. Not quite human, but too tall, too wrong. Its form was vague, shifting in the dim light. But its eyes, those eyes, glowed from the darkness, two pale orbs reflecting the faint light of my dying flashlight. I backed away, stumbling over a fallen branch. My heart raced as I tried to steady myself. What are you?" My voice came out in a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. The laughter died down, replaced by a deep, rasping breath that felt like it came from the very ground beneath me. "You already know," the voice answered, its tone impossibly low, like a voice within my bones. "I've been watching you, Nathan. You're mine now." The coldest chill ran down my spine, and before I could react, a deafening roar shattered the silence. It wasn't an animal's roar. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. It was a noise that seemed to tear through the fabric of reality itself, vibrating the air around me, rattling my teeth. The world seemed to blur at the edges as I turned and ran again, faster this time, my legs moving almost on instinct. The roar faded, but the presence was still there, closing in, chasing me with unnatural speed. My flashlight flickered out completely, leaving me in total darkness, but I didn't dare slow down. Every step felt like an eternity, every branch and twig underfoot threatening to trip me, to slow me down. I reached a clearing, gasping for breath, my eyes wild, trying to make sense of the shadows that danced around me. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, the sky above nearly black, and then I saw it. The trees had cleared, and I was standing at the edge of a vast ravine. The cliff dropped steeply, far down into an abyss of blackness, and there at the edge of the cliff stood a figure. Not the shape I had seen before, the one with the glowing eyes, but something else, something older, taller. Its limbs were long and twisted, its body covered in ragged fur that seemed to shift like the shadows. Its eyes, red and piercing, locked onto mine. I had no idea how it had gotten there so quickly, but now it didn't matter. I backed away from the edge, my breathing shallow and erratic. The creature stepped forward, its heavy footfalls echoing through the clearing. I could feel its presence now, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. Its eyes never left mine, watching, studying, waiting. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like the crackling of dry leaves. "Not here. Not in my woods." I took another step back, my eyes darting around desperately for some way out, but there was nothing. No way forward, no path to take. The forest seemed to have closed in completely, the walls pressing in on me from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved. I didn't see it coming. One moment, it was standing at the edge of the ravine, and the next, it was in front of me. So close I could smell the stench of rotting flesh on its breath. Its twisted form loomed over me, and I could feel its claws, like iron, brushing against my skin. I froze, paralyzed by fear. My mind screamed at me to move, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. The creature lowered its head, its eyes glowing with a twisted kind of satisfaction. "You've been marked," it murmured, its voice so close I could feel the vibration in my bones. "There is no escape from me now." The world went black as its claws sank into my shoulder. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been minutes, hours, days. Time lost all meaning once the creature's claws sank into my shoulder. It felt like the darkness wrapped itself around me, smothering my senses, pulling me into a void where nothing made sense. But when I woke, I wasn't where I had fallen. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It was a sharp, biting cold that seeped through my clothes and into my bones. The kind of cold that felt unnatural, like it was waiting for me to freeze from the inside out. My breath came out in white clouds, but there was no warmth to be found, not even from the blood that was still dripping down my arm. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like it was being held down by invisible hands. My head was spinning, and the world around me wavered, as if I was caught between two realities. Then I heard it. A sound like whispering. 1,000 voices murmuring at once, distant yet close. The words were unintelligible, like fragments of lost languages, but they echoed in my skull, buzzing with a low hum. I forced my eyes open. The world before me was a blur of grey and black. I was no longer in the clearing. The trees had vanished, replaced by towering stone walls that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ground beneath me was hard and cold, like a cave floor, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness hit me, and I had to lay back down. My mind was scrambling for something familiar, something to anchor me in this nightmare, but there was nothing. The stone walls, the whispering voices, the unnatural cold, none of it made sense. And then I felt it again. The presence. It was close. So close that I could almost feel the weight of its gaze pressing into my skull. I wasn't alone. The thing that had attacked me, the creature that had marked me, was here. Somewhere. "You're not dead yet," a voice whispered, as though from within the very stone walls. It was familiar, but distorted, like it had been twisted by the hollow space around us. "Not quite." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, cracked. The words wouldn't come. My mouth felt full of dust, and I gagged as I tried to swallow. "You're in my world now," the voice continued, growing closer. "A place where the living and the dead are tangled, where there is no escape." Suddenly there was movement. A shadow darted across my vision, and my heart leaped into my throat. I shot upright, my senses on high alert. It was there, in the corner of my vision, just out of reach, standing in the dark, the creature. Its form was twisted, writhing in the shadows, but now it had a shape, a face, not quite human, Not quite animal. It was like something in between, a mockery of both. Its eyes glowed with a pale, sickly light, and its mouth was stretched into a grin that seemed to stretch forever, sharp teeth gleaming in the darkness. I tried to move again, to crawl away, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The cold was numbing, and the fear gripped me tighter, each breath I took harder than the last. The creature's laughter echoed in my head, loud and grating. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Nathan," it said, its voice coming from every direction at once. "You came to my woods, and now you belong to them, to me." It stepped forward, its form gliding through the darkness, so fluid that it seemed to melt into the stone around it. I could feel its eyes on me, feel its breath like ice against my skin. "You'll never leave this place," the creature murmured. "Not alive. Not ever." I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The weight of its gaze was suffocating, and the whispering voices around me grew louder, drowning out all thought. I was trapped in a nightmare, a hollow between worlds, and I couldn't wake up. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. The cold lingered, but the oppressive weight of its presence lifted. The whispering voices faded into the background, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. I didn't dare to open my eyes. I couldn't. I was too afraid of what might be waiting for me if I did. But slowly the terror began to fade. The darkness wasn't as thick as before. The air, while still cold, wasn't quite as suffocating. The stone walls seemed less oppressive. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the hollow anymore. I was back in the forest. But the forest was different. The trees were twisted, their trunks bent at unnatural angles. The ground was soft, like wet earth, but it felt wrong, like the very land had been tainted. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. And there, standing in front of me, was the creature. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a mere presence in the dark. It was real, solid, its twisted form towering above me, eyes glowing with that same sickly pale light. "You are still mine," it whispered, its voice a low rasp. "You always will be." I backed away, my mind reeling. Was this real? Or was I still trapped in some kind of twisted dream? Some kind of hell? "Run," the creature said, its grin widening. "Run, Nathan. But remember, no matter where you go, I'll always be right behind you." And I knew in that moment that it was true. There was no escaping this, no running from it. I was trapped in its world, in its hollow. It was watching me, always. And it would never let me go. I didn't wait to think. I ran. The creature's laughter echoed in my ears, a twisted mocking sound that made every nerve in my body scream in terror. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stand still, couldn't wait for it to catch me. The air was thick, humid with decay, and the twisted trees seemed to close in on me as I stumbled through the underbrush. The ground was uneven, shifting beneath my feet, as though the very earth itself was conspiring against me. I couldn't think. I couldn't focus on anything but the one thing that drove me forward: survival. The sound of footsteps, too heavy, too deliberate, came from behind me. The creature was following. I could hear it, feel its presence looming over me. It wasn't even running. It didn't need to. It was always there, just out of sight, like a shadow stalking me through the night. Every time I dared glance over my shoulder, it was just a blur, its glowing eyes flashing through the dark, watching me, waiting. But the sound of its movements grew closer, always closer, until the silence swallowed it up again. I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the ground, my hands scraping against the rough earth. I gasped for breath, trying to push myself up, but the weight of exhaustion was too much. My legs felt like lead, my heart thudding in my chest, each beat growing more painful than the last. I could hear it now, its heavy breathing, just a few feet behind me. No, 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 I whispered to myself, scrambling to my feet. I was too slow, too weak. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, a voice, quiet, almost drowned out by the pounding of my heart, cut through the air. Go to the clearing. I froze. It was a voice, faint but distinct, human. Or at least, it sounded human. But who else could be out here in this hell? The thing that had attacked me was no longer just a thing in the shadows. It was part of this place, part of the forest. There was no one else. But the voice spoke again, this time more insistent. Go to the clearing. It's the only way. The clearing. My mind was racing. Where? What clearing? I didn't know what to trust anymore, but something about the voice felt real. It felt like a lifeline. Without thinking, I darted toward the sound, pushing through the trees, my feet moving on instinct. The shadows around me deepened, the whispers rising again, pressing in from all sides. But I kept moving, focused only on the voice, the clearing, the one place that might hold a chance, however small. The air grew thinner as I ran. My breaths were ragged, my body screaming at me to stop, to rest, to let the darkness take me. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not while there was still hope. And then, through the thick foliage, I saw it. A small patch of moonlight. A clearing. It was just ahead. A place untouched by the decay that had overtaken the rest of the forest. A small, open space bathed in silver light, with tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. It was so still, so peaceful, that for a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then the voice came again, this time clearer, more defined. Step into the light. The light. That was it. I didn't know what would happen if I followed the voice, but I didn't have a choice. I had already seen what awaited me in the darkness. I stumbled forward, pushing through the last of the trees and into the clearing. As soon as my feet touched the grass, everything changed. The air, heavy and oppressive, lifted. The whispers stopped. The oppressive feeling of being watched, of being hunted, faded, leaving only the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. But then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, standing just out of the light's reach, was the creature. Its form was darker here, more defined in the shadows, but it was still unmistakable. The twisted face, the glowing eyes, the unnatural grin. And for the first time since I had entered this nightmare, I wasn't afraid, not in the way I had been before. The creature didn't move, didn't advance. It just stood there, watching me. And then, for the first time, it spoke. You're safe here. For now. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. But I knew one thing. The creature wasn't interested in me anymore. Not like before. It wanted something else. What do you want? I asked, my voice shaking. I hadn't planned on speaking, hadn't even known if I could. But the question had come unbidden. The creature's grin widened, its eyes flickering like the last embers of a dying fire. You're not the one I'm after, it said, its voice now soft, almost regretful. But you will be soon enough. I didn't want to ask what it meant. I didn't want to know. But as I stood there, frozen, watching the creature in the moonlight, I realized one terrifying truth. I wasn't alone. Not in the way I had thought. This wasn't just a creature hunting me. It was part of something bigger, something far more ancient, something that lived in the very bones of the earth, something that would never let me go. The creature took a step back into the shadows, its eyes never leaving me. You should have never come here, Nathan. This place, it's not meant for the living. I wanted to run, to flee, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. My body was numb. my mind a swirl of confusion and dread. I was trapped. Trapped in a world that wasn't mine. A world where nothing, not even the light, could save me. The air was thick with dread, pressing against my chest, making every breath feel like an effort. My feet remained rooted to the spot, as though the earth itself was holding me here, forcing me to witness whatever it was the creature wanted me to see. It was only now, standing in the clearing, that I understood the weight of the forest's true nature, the force that had pulled me into this nightmare. The creature's eyes never wavered from mine, their unnatural glow casting an eerie reflection on the surrounding trees. It didn't move toward me, but I felt the hunger in its gaze. It wasn't done with me yet, but it wasn't alone. As I stood there, unable to tear my eyes away from the monstrous figure, the shadows around the clearing began to stir. At first it was subtle, a shift in the trees, a rustle in the undergrowth. Then slowly, figures emerged. Others like the first, their outlines dark and hazy, their glowing eyes just as piercing. The woods, it seemed, were alive with them. "Do you see it now?" The creature's voice was low, almost mournful. "This is what you've walked into. A place forgotten by time. A place where things like me and mine still roam. We are its keepers." I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was trapped in my throat. My body trembled, frozen under the weight of their presence. There was no escape. Not here. Not now. The creature tilted its head, its grin widening in a way that made my stomach churn. "You were always meant to be here. All of you. The forest knows who belongs and who doesn't. And you came looking for something, didn't you?" I wanted to deny it, to say that I didn't understand. But deep down I knew. The forest had called to me, drawn me in with promises of solitude, of peace, of nature in its purest form. But I had been wrong. There was no peace here, only shadows, hunger, and a twisted form of something ancient and cruel. "You're not the first," the creature continued. "Others have come, but you're different. You're more than just prey. You're the offering." The others stepped forward, their eyes glowing brighter now. There was no escape. The darkness was swallowing me whole. I looked around one last time, searching for any sign of hope, anything that could save me. But the trees were closing in, the light of the moon fading as if the forest itself was devouring it. I was alone, surrounded by shadows, and the voices of the lost echoed in the back of my mind. The creature's voice broke through the silence again, but this time there was something final in it. "It's time." I tried to scream, tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The darkness closed in around me, and the last thing I saw were those eyes, those piercing, glowing eyes, staring into my soul.